My name is Andrew Berman. I'm the Executive Director of Village Preservation, and we are here to unveil a plaque honoring Frances Perkins. Yeah. Before we get started, first, very briefly, if you're not familiar with Village Preservation, we've got some great literature and materials over here. We are a community organization founded in 1980. We work to celebrate, document, and preserve the special architectural heritage and cultural history of Greenwich Village, the East Village, and NoHo. We do that through a variety of means, everything from fighting for landmark protections, educational programming, online resources, and our historic plaque program, which I'm going to talk a little bit about in a moment. But I want to say a couple of quick thank yous before we get started. First of all, to our building owner, Bridget Capasso, for allowing us to place this plaque on her wonderful, wonderful, beautiful building. I say this at every plaque unveiling, but it can't be overstated. You'd think that people would just want to have plaques marking important historic figures on their buildings, and some wonderful people do. But it's actually not the easiest thing to find an owner who does want to do that. So we really, really appreciate when they do and when they're so cooperative and invested in the history of the building that they own. I want to thank Juan Rivero, our East Village and Special Projects Director, for putting this whole event together tonight. Thank you so much. And everybody from the Village Preservation staff who's here, who's pitched in to make this possible. And of course, our three incredibly distinguished speakers, Alice Kessler-Harris, Darren Block, and Joshua Freeman over here, who we will be hearing from shortly. So to get us started, I just want to put this in a little bit of context. This is Village Preservation's 25th plaque unveiling, and our plaque program has honored and marked the homes of local figures from Jane Jacobs to James Baldwin, Allen Ginsberg to Charles Mingus, Frank O'Hara to Frank Stella, and Martha Graham to Lorraine Hansberry, among many, many others. As well, and we've also marked historically significant sites such as the former NAACP headquarters on Fifth Avenue, the Fillmore East in the East Village, and Julius Bar, which is just right around the corner from here. Our plaque program focuses on locally rooted trailblazers in the arts, literature, music, politics, social justice, and labor, and there is perhaps no greater exemplar of that than Frances Perkins. Though Frances Perkins is a nationally celebrated figure, it was in the Village that she really cultivated many of the relationships that would define her landmark career. President Franklin D. Roosevelt's Secretary of Labor, she was the first woman appointed to a cabinet position and one of only two cabinet members to serve the entirety of FDR's term. But this time was only a part of a decades-long career that began long before and continued long after her time as a cabinet secretary, which we'll hear more about from some of our wonderful speakers. Perkins spent her life fighting to enact social welfare laws under the New Deal, eliminate child labor, establish a minimum wage, and promote the Social Security and Fair Labor Standards Acts. On the eve of what feels like an epoch-making presidential election, her life and her work seem more relevant and more important than ever. Perhaps less well known about Perkins are the details of her deep and formative connection to Greenwich Village. She moved to Greenwich House, which Darren now runs, around 1910, and according to her biography, she was thrilled to be there, calling it the very heart of both the theoretical and practical efforts to socialize the life of the modern city. She was enthusiastic about her new life in the Village, listening to Jack Reed, attending meetings, and speaking on street corners about local women's suffrage efforts. She was swept up in the art galleries and restaurants. She tried her hand at acting, writing, and painting. But perhaps the biggest impact upon her while in the Village occurred in March of 1911 when she witnessed the horror of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire. Like so many, she was moved by the death of nearly 150 female factory workers, mostly immigrants, and vowed to work to ensure such tragedies never happened again. When her time at Greenwich House ended, Perkins first moved into a small apartment at 164 Waverly Place, and in 1913 she moved here to 121 Washington Place, thus beginning what was an incredibly illustrious career at the local, state, and national level, having a huge impact on how we regulate, protect, and maintain the safety of workers in our country. So the first person we're going to speak to hear a little bit more about that is Alice Kessler Harris. She is the R. Gordon Hoxie Professor Emerita of American History at Columbia University. She specializes in the history of American labor and the comparative exploration of women and gender. She's written and co-edited multiple books on labor and women in America, Europe, and Australia, as well as writing about the great writer Lillian Hellman. Alice?
Thank you. Thank you, everybody, and thank you for having me here. I'm delighted to be here because I'm a long-standing admirer of Frances Perkins. And I want to speak today from the perspective of somebody who knows that Frances Perkins was not generally much admired in her lifetime, at least not at the beginning of her lifetime, and afterwards mostly begrudgingly. It's only recently that historians have begun to take another look at her and to think about all the good things that she did. But I want to sort of frame my short remarks with a kind of story. Maybe it's a kind of explanation of why it is that Frances Perkins should be and perhaps is now beloved in a way that she never was in her lifetime. When she saw that triangle fire in 1911 that Darren referred to, wasn't Darren, but forgive me, referred to. Andrew, thank you. When she saw that fire come down, she recalled in her memoirs that the fire had a dramatic influence on her, and that it confirmed what she had learned from her early experience working in the settlement house movement. In that experience, she said that what she wanted to do was to make the world a better place for workers, that it was the poor that she identified with, and she never had understood why poverty was so necessary to the functioning of American society. When the Triangle Fire occurred, and it killed 146 men and women, but only about half a dozen men, and the rest were young immigrant women. When the Triangle Fire occurred, she said she wanted to dedicate her life to making, to workers' safety, to making sure that the workplace was a safe place for workers. And that's what she did. And you would think from our perspective today that that would be a very good goal. But Frances Perkins thought that the way to do that was through legislation and legislative reform. And that idea was in 1911, 12, 13, 14, all those pre-war years and even some of the post-war years, an extraordinarily unpopular idea, because regulation had hampered the labor movement. It had been the thing that had kept labor from organizing, and when labor organized, drew governmental wrath down on striking workers or workers who tried to protest. So calling in the government wasn't particularly popular. And labor unions in general did not want more government regulation. What they wanted was the power to organize themselves, to bargain collectively, to create their own contractual relationships with employers. Not Frances in those early days. She was connected to a group of reformers, often female reformers, who believed that the labor union movement wasn't paying any attention to women or to immigrants, and that movement needed to be supported or juxtaposed by legislation at the state, not yet at the federal level, but at the state level. So when she was appointed Commissioner of when she was appointed first a member of the Industrial Commission in New York State, and then later became Commissioner of Labor in New York State, her appointment was greeted with grumbles, anger, opposition from the trade union movement in general. Labor leaders did not like her. She was a woman. She was a middle-class woman, not one of them. She hadn't come up from the workplace or from the factory floor. What was she doing in that job? And then, lo and behold, she did, in fact, follow the prescription of making regulatory change mostly for women in those New York years. But then when FDR appointed her his Secretary of Labor, the loud grumbles grew even louder. So here was the first woman cabinet member trying to take on a major job in the administration, and she was, instead of being loudly cheered, she was greeted with all the misogyny and the anger that you might now recognize. That's Frances Perkins. But Frances Perkins deserved better than that, and she actually proved herself better than that. Because although the labor union movement objected to her, she didn't object to the labor union movement. And in fact, she thought labor was fine. Labor organizing was fine. It just needed a little help from the government. And I think you'll hear later from Josh what kind of help that was that she gave. But the story that I have to tell is a story of how slowly she brought the labor movement into her purview and into the purview of her role as Secretary of Labor, pulling them into the negotiations for the Social Security Act, for example, pulling them into and modifying unemployment insurance, which was part of the Social Security Act, making sure that labor was consulted in the creation of the National Labor Relations Board, and the Wagner Act, which was the first act to recognize the right of workers to bargain collectively. She became a good friend of Sidney Hillman's, and she hung out with the likes of David Dubinsky, making sure that when she made proposals, that those proposals considered the demands of labor. And so by World War II, she was still Secretary of Labor. She served in that role for 12 years throughout the FDR administration. When World War II happened, she was in a very good position to do what she did successfully, which was to mediate strikes, to have a voice on behalf of labor in the many instances of employers trying to take advantage of the war to make excess profits. In other words, here was a woman, the first woman, and the first female cabinet member, but the first woman, indeed the first person, to try to make a liaison between the labor movement and government regulations. When I think about that today, I think about Frances Perkins as the person we need now. She was dealing with a very different labor movement. She made compromises that none of us would approve of today. including compromises that excluded people like agricultural workers and domestic workers from the Social Security Act and from unemployment insurance and some of the goodies that she negotiated. But she did it with an eye to joining the labor movement. I sometimes wish that today, in light of what you can only think of as the dip in the labor movement that occurred after the 1970s, I sometimes think today that the rising labor movement we see today, if that rising labor movement only had the kind of Secretary of Labor, the kind of ability to liaise with governmental agencies that Frances Perkins developed, that we'd have both better safety regulations, better conditions for workers, but also that we would have a more civil discourse about how to construct workers' rights in America. That's why I admire Frances Perkins.
Didn't Roosevelt create the position of Secretary of Labor?
Pardon?
Didn't Roosevelt create the position of Secretary of Labor?
No, the position of Secretary of Labor emerged after 1913 when the cabinet position was created.
Thank you very, very much, Alice. We appreciate that. Our next speaker is going to also give us a little bit of perspective on Frances. Darren Block is the CEO and Executive Director of Greenwich House, which serves 20,000 New Yorkers each year with healthcare and social services, educational and arts programming, and civic and community enrichment and engagements. Darren, who I've known for many years, has had a distinguished career leading organizations and teams across government, nonprofit, media, and corporate sectors. And of course, as I mentioned before, Greenwich House has a special relationship to Frances Perkins. So, Darren, please join us.
Thanks, Andrew. Thank you, Juan, for organizing this. And thank you to the entire Village Preservation family, your staff, board members, supporters that enable events like this to take place. I'm sandwiched between two academics, so I'm not an idiot. I'm not going to go through a history lesson. But I do want to frame, to the point that Alice just made, I do want to weave in a little bit of a story. And if this were a movie, this would be a little bit of a flashback. Because I'm honored today to join Village Preservation and partners across our community to recognize truly a life and visionary leader in Frances Perkins. Frances embodied a compassion and a commitment to building up neighbors and neighborhoods that helped change the lives of hundreds, if not thousands, of individuals locally here in our city, and obviously went on to impact hundreds of thousands, if not millions of others across our country. And again, you heard this alluded to, it was really the heart of a settlement house movement. And as Andrew noted, I spent about 25 years in government and public service before I landed here at Greenwich House. And I have to say, the idea of a settlement house was something that was rather ignorant to me. And it is an idea that I would say is the oldest, newest innovation in what community building should look like. It is creating a central hub of multi-service, multi-generation activities that really, at its heart, is about bringing people together to serve and respond to the evolving needs of a neighborhood, of a city, of a community. Frances's work helped build up Greenwich House, and it was at the forefront of those early days of a settlement house movement here in the city. And its spirit and work that we see to this day carried forward every day in our dedication to advance equity and care for our community. At Greenwich House here, Frances Perkins embraced that model, which prioritized uplifting communities from within by addressing daily struggles of ordinary working people. She worked closely with community members, advocating for labor rights and education, social reforms that would become and empower individuals to improve their lives collectively. The experience reinforced her belief that social justice wasn't just about policy. It was about fostering solidarity and resilience and a shared sense of responsibility in our neighborhoods. It's something that is one of the most touching things that I've seen working at a settlement house here in an area that 100 years ago was the densest immigrant population in our country. 100 years later, this is probably one of the most resourced communities in our country, and yet there's still that collective goodwill and that that perspective of shared responsibility that allows places like Greenwich House and places like Village Preservation to persist. Her story reminds us that real change begins first and foremost on the ground in our communities, in the bonds that we create with each other, and in shared commitment to building a more just world. So with that, I'm just going to say one last thing, which Alice alluded to, and it's something I love referencing, about our founder, Mary Simkovich Kingsbury. Frances Perkins and Mary Simkovich represented a generation of, and I don't know how else to say it other than progressive badass women. This was a generation of women that could not bring their ambition and their smarts and their resources into what is available today, still with challenges, but into business, into government, into these places without a huge fight and a help up. And nonprofits in places like Greenwich House and Henry Street Settlement and University Settlement were places where we saw that intelligence and that fire come to life in the form of so much good. But I say it today because, again, as Andrew noted, on the cusp of another historic election where I feel like so many rights and so many freedoms are under assault, but particularly for women in our community, in our city, in our country, in our world. I look back on a legacy of what folks like Frances Perkins led with, and it inspires me to be an ally and to be a friend and to keep advancing Greenwich House as a women's-led organization in that. So I'll close by just noting, again, another thank you to Village Preservation for marking this spot in the memory of Frances Perkins, her role, her legacy, and thank you for allowing us not to forget that. Thank you so much.
If I can just add one more word. All those badass women that came out of the settlement movement, Frances Perkins in the New Deal brought those women into the federal government, and they became not cabinet members, but bureaucrats in the expanding state. So people like Grace Abbott, Mary Dewson, Caroline O'Day became a politician. You could name them. But we have to remember that the connection between the settlement movement and governmental activity was very, very close in that period.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Darren, and thank you for that additional insight. Our final speaker before our unveiling, last but certainly not least, is Joshua Freeman, who's a distinguished professor of history at the City University of New York. He's written extensively about the history of labor, modern America, and New York City. He has written and co-edited numerous books on American labor history and has consulted for unions and for the New York City Central Labor Council on strategy and internal education. Joshua.
Thanks. It's really a great pleasure to be here as part of the dedication of this plaque on Frances Perkins' former residence. I think in a modest way, having this plaque might help keep her name or bring her name forward to future generations. You know, in the mid-20th century, Frances Perkins was a household name. You know, even people who did not particularly follow public affairs knew who she was. You know, now that's certainly not the case today. Most people, if you mention her name, would be blank. If they've heard of her at all, it's because they might have had a textbook when they were in school that said someplace in passing that she was the first female member of the United States cabinet. You know, there have been hundreds of members of the U.S. cabinet, and most of them are completely forgettable. They deserve to be forgotten. You know, but Perkins doesn't. She should be remembered as a pathbreaker who really did help transform American life in profound and lasting ways. You know, that Frances Perkins became the Secretary of Labor in 1933 in itself is remarkable. You know, it's worth stopping for a second and thinking about that. At that point, the U.S. government had been operating for 150 years, and Throughout that period of time, every single federal department had always been led by a white man. Very, very few women had offices or significant posts in any level of government. Nationally, women could only vote in the presidential election for the first time in 1920. That's only 13 years before Perkins entered the cabinet. When in 1919, Governor Al Smith brought her on, as Alice mentioned, as a member of the New York State Industrial Commission, she was the first woman ever to hold a significant administrative post in the state of New York. And she was the highest paid female government official in the entire history of the nation. Franklin Roosevelt, of course, appointed her as industrial commissioner. That's the head of the New York State Labor Department. And she proved so important in both conceiving of and implementing his labor and welfare policies that he did not hesitate to break that barrier and appoint her as Secretary of Labor when he became president. And she ended up being, and to this day, the fourth longest serving cabinet official in the United States history. Perkins was superbly suited to be a top federal official because, as Alice discussed, she believed in the power of government to do good. She had no objection to social work. As Darren talked about, that's the world she came out of. And she certainly did not object. She supported organized labor. But it was government, she thought, above all else, that had the ability to radically improve the lives of working people, including the large majority of workers who at every moment in our country's history have not belonged to unions. Government, in Perkins' view, could serve the public as both a regulator of labor conditions, of labor relations, and as a provider of social benefits. So in the Roosevelt administration, she had that rare opportunity to make her belief into a reality. In the early days of the New Deal, Frances Perkins was one of the major forces behind the government policy of large-scale federal spending to create jobs for the unemployed, which, of course, in the process created new infrastructure all across the country. The high school that I went to in Queens, which, by the way, is also the high school our mayor went to, was constructed by the New Deal, during that period of time. Perkins was in charge of implementing the Civilian Conservation Corps. She was on the committee that allocated the funds for public works. She headed the Committee on Economic Security, which crafted the Social Security Act, and she was a strong backer of the 1938 Fair Labor Standards Act. It's a mouthful of names of laws. What did it mean? Well, it transformed the role that the federal government played in the life of ordinary people. For the first time, the national government saw as its responsibility to meet the needs of workers and their families who, through no fault of their own, were suffering from the ravages of unemployment. And it did this in multiple ways, including creating a system of unemployment insurance and in creating jobs for those without them. The Social Security Act had transformative meaning for the old, for the disabled, for children in need by providing retirement benefits, disability payments, and aid to dependent children. The Fair Labor Standards Act established the federal minimum wage. It set maximum hours. It provided for overtime pay. These things don't go back forever. There's a moment they start, It banned homework. And Perkins not only helped craft these laws, she enforced them, and at the same time supported the growth of the labor movement. She was one of Roosevelt's key troubleshooters as the working class became energized in this new political climate, which meant lots of conflict, and one of her jobs was to try to help settle it. It's fitting that her very last government job is one I don't think most people are that aware of. In the Truman administration, she was a member of the Civil Service Commission. And I think that's a kind of nice recognition of her belief in the importance of government entities and the importance of people who served in them. Now, I'm in the unfortunate position of being the last speaker, so Darren and Alice stole my conclusion, which was to say, as they've already said, but it's worth reinforcing, that Frances Perkins was part of a network of women who went in the early 20th century, from social reform, from social work, with ties to the labor movement, to political activism, and then in many cases to public office. And I think they brought with them a kind of, I think Darren used the word, or maybe it was Andrew, a kind of progressive vision of what government can do for ordinary people, and to create a kind of more democratic society. And I think we owe them a huge debt for making our society so much better, and it's nice that we're paying a tiny bit of that debt here today. Thank you.
Thank you so much to all of our speakers. And now, for the highlight of the evening, we're going to be joined by Bridget, and I'll ask our speakers to join us as well for the unveiling. And of course, this will be here hopefully in perpetuity, so that whenever people walk by, they know that this incredible woman who had such an impact on our country and our society lived here, was inspired here, and did her work here. So let's grab. There we go, and I will read to everybody what it says. Frances Perkins, 1880 to 1965. Here lived Frances Perkins, the first woman to serve as a presidential cabinet secretary. A lifelong champion of workers' rights, she served as Secretary of Labor in FDR's administration for 12 years, playing an instrumental role in the formulation and implementation of New Deal programs. Her leadership helped lift the country from the depths of an economic crisis placed by village preservation. Thank you so much, everybody. And if you didn't receive it, we have some information about all of our other plaques all throughout our neighborhoods. As I said, there's 25 of them. Learn more about them. Learn more about the people connected to them, the great places of history in our neighborhood, as well as how you can get more involved with our work. So thank you so much, everybody, for turning out tonight. Thank you again, Bridget, so much for allowing us to do this. And thank you to Darren from Greenwich House and our wonderful speakers for shedding light on this incredible transformative figure.